He rescued a struggling bobcat kitten, then she came back years later. There are moments in a man's life that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with warning or fanfare. They simply happen, quietly, at the edge of an ordinary day and somehow change the entire shape of everything that follows. What happened to Dale Hurst on that cold October morning in the foothills of rural Tennessee began with nothing more than a sound, a small, fragile sound, barely a cry at all, coming from somewhere beneath the low-hanging brush along the back fence of his property. He almost walked past it. Almost. The morning had started the way most of Dale's mornings did in the weeks after his retirement, slowly, without particular purpose, with a thermos of black coffee and the habit of walking his land before the day warmed up. 53 acres of mixed timber and open meadow, the same land his father had worked, the same fence line he'd repaired 100 times over 30 years. He wasn't looking for anything. He rarely was anymore. But something made him stop near the old cedar post at the property's eastern edge, just past where the tree line thinned. He crouched down, pushed aside a tangle of dried grass, and found her. She was no larger than both his hands cupped together. A bobcat kitten, maybe 3 weeks old at most, her spotted fur matted and damp, her breathing shallow and uneven. She lay curled against the base of the post as if she'd pressed herself there deliberately, using the wood for what little warmth it held. Her eyes, that pale, clouded blue of newborn wild things, were barely open. One ear twitched when his shadow fell over her. That was the only sign she gave that she was still alive. Dale had lived in these hills long enough to understand the rhythms of the wildlife around him. He knew that bobcat mothers sometimes moved their young, that a kitten found alone wasn't always an abandoned kitten, so he did what any measured, experienced man of the land would do. He waited. He went back to the house, refilled his coffee, and returned to check on her an hour later. She hadn't moved. Her breathing, if anything, was more labored. The temperature was dropping, and there was no sign anywhere in the surrounding brush or tree line of her mother. By afternoon, he made a decision he didn't fully think through. Not because he was impulsive. Dale Hurst was anything but impulsive, but because he'd spent enough years on this earth to know when a living thing had run out of time to wait on the right answer. He brought her inside. He set her in a shallow cardboard box lined with an old flannel shirt, placed near but not too near the wood stove in the kitchen. He warmed a small amount of kitten milk replacer he'd driven 20 minutes to the nearest farm supply store to buy, filled a syringe without a needle, and coaxed a few drops past her lips. She resisted at first, then she didn't. By nightfall she had taken nearly a full feeding. By the following morning she had moved to the corner of the box and was watching him with the focused, unblinking attention that would come to define her entire personality. He called her Scout, not as a pet name, more as a recognition of what she already was. Even at that age, barely stable on her legs, she studied everything, the way the light moved across the kitchen floor, the sound of the coffee maker, the particular cadence of Dale's boots on the hardwood. She catalogued the world around her with a stillness and precision that was nothing short of remarkable in something so small and so recently close to death. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet routine. Every few hours, feedings, warmth, careful handling, enough to keep her calm, not so much as to blur the line between wild and tame. Dale had read everything he could find on rehabilitating wild felids. He knew the protocols. He understood the risks, legal, physical, and emotional. He told himself, clearly and often, that this was temporary, that the goal was her survival, not her domestication, that he was a caretaker, not an owner. He believed that. He meant it completely. And yet, as anyone who has ever nursed a wild animal back from the edge of death will quietly understand, there is a particular kind of bond that forms in those early weeks that doesn't ask your permission before it takes root. It doesn't announce itself. It grows in the space between a 3 a.m. feeding and the small, exhausted relief of watching a tiny chest rise and fall steadily in the dark. It grows in the moment she first climbs out of the box on her own and crosses the kitchen floor to sit near his feet. It grows in silence and in patience and in the accumulated weight of all the small acts of care that no one else will ever see or know about. By the time Scout was 2 months old, she was strong, curious, and entirely herself, a wild creature in full possession of her nature, living temporarily inside the walls of a man's quiet, solitary life. She had given him something he hadn't known he was missing. And somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the practicality and the discipline and the knowledge of what was right, He already dreaded the day he would have to honor the promise he had made to her from the beginning, the promise to let her go. The change came gradually, the way most honest things do. Around her 4th month, Scout began sleeping less near the wood stove and more by the door. She would sit for long stretches at the window that faced the tree line, her tail moving in that slow, deliberate way, not restless but attentive, reading something beyond the glass that Dale couldn't hear or see. He recognized it for what it was, he just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Her play shifted too, less curious, more purposeful. The way she stalked a shadow across the floor had changed. There was genuine intent behind it now, a precision that no amount of domestic comfort could soften. She was practicing. Her body was remembering something older than either of them, something written so deep in her nature that no flannel-lined box or careful hand-feeding had touched it. She was becoming exactly what she was always meant to be. Dale had contacted a wildlife rehabilitator early on, a woman named Carol Sims who worked with the state and knew the legal landscape around wild felid care. They had spoken several times over the months. Carol had guided him through the process, monitored Scout's development remotely, and had been straightforward with him from their very first conversation. The goal was always release. A healthy bobcat, properly matured, belonged in the wild. Anything else was a disservice to the animal, no matter how good the intentions behind it. He knew she was right. He had always known. On a gray morning in late March, Scout, now nearly 6 months old, lean and capable and breathtaking to watch move, Dale loaded her into the reinforced transport carrier he had prepared weeks earlier. She went in without much resistance, which somehow made it harder. He drove to a release site Carol had selected, mature forest, good prey base, far enough from roads and residential areas to give her a real chance. He set the carrier down at the edge of the tree line, unlatched the door, stepped back. Scout didn't bolt. She moved to the opening slowly, scented the air for a long moment, ears forward, eyes sharp, and then stepped out onto the leaf-covered ground with the quiet authority of something returning to its rightful place. She paused once, looked back at him with that steady, unreadable gaze he had come to know so well. Then she walked into the trees and disappeared. Dale stood there for a while after she was gone. The forest was still, the sky was low and colorless. He told himself he had done the right thing. He believed it. Most days. 3 years passed. Dale's life settled back into its familiar rhythms. The morning walks, the fence repairs, the slow and honest work of a man comfortable with solitude. He thought about Scout sometimes, more often than he admitted. On certain evenings when the tree line turned dark against a fading sky, he'd find himself watching the edge of the property longer than necessary, not expecting anything, just looking. He told himself that was enough, that knowing she was out there somewhere, alive, wild, free, was its own kind of closure. He had done what he set out to do. The rest wasn't his to hold on to. Then one morning in early November, something caught his eye. He was on the back porch with his coffee, the same as always, when a movement at the far edge of the meadow made him go still. A shape, low and deliberate, just inside the shadow of the tree line, watching the house. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, the coffee cooling in his hand, his breath steady. It was a bobcat, fully grown, a female by her build, compact and precise, with the characteristic short tail and tufted ears of her kind. She stood at the boundary between the open meadow and the woods as though she had drawn a line for herself and was deciding something. Her gaze was fixed, calm and direct in a way that felt less like the weariness of a wild animal and more like the quiet recognition of something remembered. Dale's chest tightened. He didn't know with certainty. There was no way to know with certainty. But there are things a person understands without proof, things recognized not in the mind but somewhere older and quieter. The way she stood, the particular steadiness of her attention, the fact that she didn't run even as he slowly lowered himself to sit on the porch steps, reducing his height, making himself smaller, the way he used to do in the kitchen when Scout was young and easily startled. The bobcat remained at the tree line for several minutes. Then, without urgency, she turned, and that's when Dale saw them. 2 kittens, small and spotted, tumbling into view from the brush behind her. She glanced back once, gathered them with her presence the way only a mother can, and guided them back into the shadow of the woods. Within seconds they were gone. Dale sat on those porch steps for a long time after. He wasn't sure what to call what he felt. It wasn't quite joy. It wasn't quite grief. It was something in between, something that only arrives when a person realizes, without warning, that a story they thought was finished never really was. He didn't tell many people about what he saw that morning, not because he doubted it, but because some things lose something in the telling. They belong to the person who lived them, held quietly the way you hold anything that matters. Dale mentioned it once to Carol Sims briefly in a phone call about something unrelated. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said simply, "That happens sometimes, with the ones who remember." Neither of them said anything after that. They didn't need to. The weeks that followed felt different in a way Dale couldn't precisely name. The land felt less empty, not because anything visible had changed. The mornings were the same, the fence line was the same, the long amber evenings were the same, but something in his relationship to the silence around him had shifted. It felt inhabited now, watched over, in some quiet and unassuming way. He began leaving the back porch light off at night. He wasn't sure exactly why. It felt like the right thing to do, a small courtesy extended toward whatever was moving through the tree line after dark. He started noticing tracks in the soft mud near the creek that ran along the property's southern edge, small ones alongside larger ones. He crouched down and studied them the way his father had taught him to read the land, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. He didn't follow them. He just noted that they were there, and left the area undisturbed. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from resolution, but from acceptance, from finally releasing the need to understand everything fully or hold it too tightly. Dale had spent much of his life as a practical man, grounded in what could be measured, fixed, and known, but the older he got, the more he understood that the most important things rarely fit inside those categories. They arrived unexpectedly, they asked nothing in return, and they left quietly, on their own terms, the way Scout had walked into those trees 3 years ago, without looking back for long. He still took his morning walks, still stopped at the eastern fence line out of old habit, where the cedar posts stood, where everything had begun on a cold October morning with a sound barely louder than the wind. He didn't always see anything there, but sometimes at the far edge of the meadow, just before the light fully settled over the land, he would catch a stillness in the tree line that felt different from the ordinary stillness of the woods, and he would nod once to whatever was watching and go on with his morning.